Imagine there's a hypothetical future war between India and China. And imagine that India finds itself in a situation where it has to ask the US for help. The question is, will the US be willing to help India? And the answer is yes, the US will be happy to help India, but this help will come with strings attached. The US will demand that India agree to a number of conditions in exchange, in return for this help. So, what could these conditions be? Please subscribe and let's find out what they could be. This video is brought to you by my Geopolitics course, Geopolitics from First Principles. The link is in the description below. So, first of all, why would India and China go to war hypothetically in the future? Well, that war would be initiated by China. China is the aggressor in the India-China relationship. India does not claim any Chinese territory. India does not threaten China. It's China that claims Indian territory. It's China that has been, for the longest time, threatening India consistently. So if a war does break out, it will be initiated by China. So let's say there's a war. And in what situation, in what scenario would India have to go to the US and ask for help? Well, in this hypothetical future war, such a scenario would happen if India was in danger of losing significant amount of territories and India's very existence, India's very sovereignty were threatened. Only in such a condition would India go and ask the US for help. So it's mainly about territorial loss, significant territorial loss. And the Chinese, typically, if they go to war with India, they would seek to capture the whole of Arunachal Pradesh. They would seek to capture definitely Tawang. Tawang is very much on the agenda. And they would seek to capture other Indian territories further westwards. So that would be the Chinese objective. And India would have to go to the US if significant amounts of territory were in danger of being captured by the Chinese. So let's say India goes to the US and the US agrees to help India, but gives a list of conditions. What could these conditions be like? Well, first of all, the US will want US military bases in India along the northern border with Tibet. A number of US military bases. They would want full access and control of a number of Indian military bases in this region. They would need Air Force bases as well, airstrips, landing strips, all that. And they would also demand access to certain naval bases, ports. And eventually they would want, once the war is over, that this presence in India, US military presence in India, becomes permanent and troops and equipment are permanently stationed in India. So that would be the condition they would give to India, that India has to agree to these conditions for US help. But that's just the first condition. What's next? Well, next, the US will demand that India participate in American sanctions against Russia. You're surprised? Of course they would ask for that. So India should participate in US sanctions against Russia. India should stop buying Russian oil. India should stop buying Russian weapons and arms and ammunition. India must allow the US to inspect the Russian weapons it has in its arsenal so that the Americans can understand the Russian technological capabilities. If India still had INS Chakra, the Akula class submarine, nuclear attack submarine, the Americans would have demanded access to that as well. But that's no longer with India. It's been returned to Russia. So that's about Russia. These would be the demands vis-a-vis India and Russia. Then they will demand complete access to India's nuclear program. They will demand complete access to India's missile program. And they will lay down the condition that there should be no further development of nuclear weapons. The Indian nuclear weapons program needs to be frozen. That will be their demand, a key demand. And then they will say that since we are asking you to freeze and essentially dismantle your nuclear program and your ballistic missile program, so in return for that, we will station our nuclear weapons with our missiles on your territory. So they will essentially offer India the same deal they have offered Japan. The benefit of the protection of the US nuclear umbrella. And Japan also benefits from this. And then the US will demand that India becomes a formal US military ally. so that it can benefit from US protection, just like Japan does, just like Australia does, and so on. So India will have to become formally a US military ally, which comes with a whole host of conditions. There's a lot of fine print in that treaty. That's what India will have to agree to. Then they will talk about the Indian economy. They will demand that India opens up its economy and its market to the US, to US companies. They will want unimpeded access to the Indian market. There should be no more trade and tariff barriers, which is kind of a sore point between the two nations right now. They will require that entirely US owned companies be allowed to open up in India. Right now, there are rules. If a foreign company wants to set up base in India, they need to have a joint venture with a local entity, and there's a cap on what percentage of the new company the foreign entity can own. So that will have to be scrapped, and India will have to allow entirely US owned companies to set up base in India. Then they will want the Indian market, the Indian economy to be consumption based, not production based, and India should export services instead of goods and products that are manufactured. And if India does manufacture goods and products, then those need to be manufactured for the benefit of the US and Western market, and the manufacturing should be done by US companies, US owned companies based in India, and the profits should be allowed to go back to the US. So that's about the economy. What next? Well, next, they will require that India should normalize relations with Pakistan and offer certain concessions to Pakistan. For example, reimpose Article 370 in Kashmir, a small concession just to make Pakistan feel good and make it feel like, yes, now we can talk to India and normalize relations. So that will be a key demand of the US to normalize relations with Pakistan and reimpose, let's say, Article 370 in Kashmir. Next, they will say, roll back the FCRA curbs. FCRA means Foreign Contribution Regulation Act. So that's an act of the Indian government by which companies that register for this, that are registered for FCRA and who have FCRA licenses, they can receive money from abroad, from other countries. So typically it's NGOs that receive money from abroad. Typically it's think tanks that receive money from abroad, and so on and so forth. So you have to be FCRA registered. You need to have an FCRA registration or license. So of late, the Indian government has been clamping down and cancelling the FCRA registrations of a number of NGOs and think tanks and all that. So typically these NGOs, they serve foreign interests. They're typically, let's say, religious NGOs that conduct large-scale religious conversions in India, conversions to foreign religions. There are think tanks that further the agenda and the national interest of foreign powers at the expense of India, and so on. So India has been clamping down on this. India has been cancelling the FCRA registrations of a number of these entities, NGOs, think tanks, and all that. So the US will say, roll back all of these FCRA curbs, allow everybody to receive money from foreign countries, essentially the US. Next, the US will require the right, they will demand the right to conduct unimpeded subnational diplomacy in India. So what is subnational diplomacy? Subnational diplomacy is when US officials, typically diplomatic officials from the embassies, from the embassy and consulates, etc., they engage with local politicians in various Indian states one-to-one. So it's all essentially about interfering in the internal affairs of India, and they typically engage with politicians and political parties that are typically opposed to the central government. And it is also alleged that the US may have allegedly funded and created entirely new political parties in India. So they will want the right to do more of this. Unimpeded, unobstructed access and right to indulge in such activities. That's what will be demanded. Next, they will require that India allow US experts to sit as advisors for the Indian education system. So obviously the Indian education system is very flawed, it's very backward, it's very primitive compared to the US. So the US will offer India the benefit of its experts to reform the education system. So they will want to correct the curriculum, let's say, in subjects like history, and so on. They will want to promote the superior American values. Uh, Essentially, it means promoting uh, what's called woke ideology and all that. So they will want that to happen. So they will demand the right. They will demand access to the Indian education system. They will want their experts to be taken as advisors, policy advisors, curriculum advisors, and so on. And all of these demands, they will require that India sign a formal treaty agreeing to all of these terms. India will have to officially and formally sign a treaty with the US, agreeing to all of these terms. And the text of the treaty will not be made public, but the treaty will be binding because India has officially signed it. And the US military presence that will happen in India in such a hypothetical scenario, this US military presence will enforce this treaty. So after a few months, after the war is over, if India feels like, okay, now we don't want to do it, that won't be allowed. The US military presence will ensure that the treaty is enforced. All right. So now do you understand why India is a genuinely sovereign nation today? Because India does not have to do any of that. No nation can demand all of these terms and conditions of India. That's why India is a genuinely sovereign nation. Take a look at the Chavda Index of Hard Power, which is going to be released soon. This is the top 20 nations in the world. If you look closer, you will see that only 4 of these nations, the top 4, are fully sovereign nations. Their sovereignty risk is low and their sovereignty score is above 1. Out of more than 190 nations in the world, only 4 nations are fully sovereign. It's the US, it's Russia, it's China, and India. And all the other nations have a sovereignty score of less than 1. How did I calculate this? Well, if you want to understand, check out my course. The link is in the description below. So that's what it means to be a sovereign nation. And in case India suffers a setback in a future hypothetical war with China, India could end up losing its sovereignty. If it has to go to the US and ask for help, such help will be given in exchange for almost complete loss of sovereignty. So India will be forced to hand over its destiny to the US. For example, like the UK, like Australia, like all the NATO members, all the members of NATO, like Japan, like South Korea. Each of these cases is slightly different. Japan is under complete US occupation and so on. But there you have it. So in case such a scenario does play out, then India will, in exchange for US help, have to hand over its sovereignty to the US and hand over its destiny to the US. And let's say India does hypothetically agree to such terms in a hypothetical future war. Then what does the US do after India signs on the dotted line? Well, in the US will obviously first of all send their troops, their aircraft, their naval ships, warships and all that to the bases that they want to occupy in India. And then they will conduct, after a while, some diplomacy with China. First, they will allow China to grab some territory, a reasonably large amount of territory. Then they will, once all the troops and aircraft and all that are in place and nuclear weapons are in place, they will conduct diplomacy with China. Tell the Chinese, okay, now this is the red line. We are here now. India is now under our protection. You need to back off. And the Chinese will back off because they will have gained some territory and they will essentially have gotten what they want, perhaps. But maybe the Chinese also may not have calculated that such a big new risk will appear almost at their doorstep. So it could end up doing more harm than good to China. But for India, the harm will be, in such a hypothetical scenario, fictitious scenario, the harm for India will be incalculable. So that is a completely fictitious hypothetical future scenario. If India has to go to the US for help, this is what will happen. And it's not some imaginary scenario that I'm cooking up for you. This has happened throughout history. Welcome to the real world. This is how the world works. Take a look at how the British Empire expanded in India after it captured a toehold in West Bengal. Through these means, one of the straightforward examples is Manipur. In the early 19th century, Manipur was conquered and occupied by the Burmese Empire. And the king of Manipur had to go to the British to ask for help and protection. The British were very happy to come to his aid, to the aid of Manipur, and offer their protection to Manipur. And they installed a political agent in the court in Manipur, in Imphal. And they also signed a treaty with the Burmese. And this entry of the British into this matter was the beginning of the downfall of not just the kingdom of Manipur, but also the kingdom of Burma. Both were annexed, occupied, and essentially destroyed, and they are both still suffering from the lingering effects, horrible lingering effects of British rule. So that is what can happen. That is kind of the worst case scenario. So India has to ensure that such a scenario never comes to pass. India, I have already laid out 5 things India needs to do to ensure that China behaves and ensure that there is no war between India and China. One of the things is a nuclear deterrent, and we have a very good nuclear deterrent in India. I'll not go into the details of that, but India needs to do more. We always need to do more. So remember this, India has no friends. India has no military allies. India is entirely on its own, and that is what it means to be a sovereign, non-imperialist nation. You are entirely on your own. But that's how it should be if you want to be a sovereign nation. So that's the situation. Get used to it. And that's about it. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.